This is episode 30 of Soul Care with Stevie Boy. I guess in some ways, 30 episodes is a little bit of a milestone. On the other hand, it's just 30. It's not like I don't expect to get a medal or a trophy. So, anyway, if you've been hanging in there and going through this with me, then you're probably the one that deserves a medal or a trophy. We're in chapter 3, hard to imagine. And last episode, we looked at what Paul kind of, not of two minds, but two different directions. In the first direction, rejoice. And in the second direction, watch out for the dogs, the mutilators of the flesh. These were the Judaizers. These were, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they were perhaps well intentioned, but they had their theology messed up. In fact, their efforts to try and have everybody who wanted to become a Christian, who wanted to come to Jesus, to have to observe the law so that it would have been impossible in their mind to be a Christian and not somehow Judaized. Well, Paul was, wow, I can't even describe to you how deeply this offended him and how little he wanted to give these people even a foothold into the life of the church. And he talks about it in verse 2. He says, watch out for those dogs, those evildoers, those mutilators of the flesh. And then he goes on to say, for it is we who are the circumcision, we who serve God by his Spirit, who boast in Christ Jesus, and who put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reasons for such confidence. There's some terminology here that we don't use often at all, and I don't think it occurs even outside the church in terms of usage. We who are the circumcision. This was a term that the Jews in Paul's day, in Jesus' day, would give themselves. We are of the circumcision, meaning we are the in group. We are the approved. This circumcision certifies that we are in this relationship with God. Paul goes a little bit out of his way, in fact, to say it is not the physical circumcision that makes you the circumcision. He says it is we, as opposed to they, who are the circumcision, we who serve God by his Spirit. There's a quick glancing blow, I believe, at the idea Jews served God out of effort. And they served him out of obligation. They served him out of commitment. And these are not wrong motives. But when they are your only motive, they sometimes take love out of the equation. Paul says, we're the ones who serve God by his Spirit. That's interesting little concept, to serve God by his Spirit. I think when you look at what your motive is, that's the beginning thing. And then there has to come with, so what is my mode? Okay, this is why, and this is how I do what I do. I do this because I love him. I serve God out of love for him. And how I serve him is through the power of the Spirit, not just my own effort, not just my own gritted teeth and sweat from my brow, who boast in Christ Jesus. See, that's kind of one of the hard things about legalism, which I think is the word that all of this basically comes under. When people are into keeping the law, achievement through effort, and relationship with God through obedience, that quickly becomes legalism, which is a point of view that strangles growth and health. And our relationship to God is not about how well, how often, or even how well intentioned we obey. Our relationship to God is on the basis of His grace toward us. And how we obey is our response to His grace, by His grace as well. And so those who were of the Judaizers would often boast about how they took care of the widows, they followed the law, they hadn't missed a Sabbath, they hadn't missed a Passover, they had done and done and done and done. It was like the scoreboard just kept clicking forward for them. And Paul says, I only have one thing to boast in, and that is in Jesus, in what Jesus Christ has done for me. That's my only boast. I think that's pretty good for anybody who boast in Christ Jesus and who put no confidence in the flesh. See, only confident people boast. That's not true. Do you realize that a lot of the people who make the loudest boasts tend to be the least confident? And one of the reasons they boast is to bolster their confidence. Paul says, our confidence is in Christ. That's why we boast. We don't have confidence in our flesh. And when he says our flesh, what he's talking about is not so much the flesh and bones, the meat and blood and all of that, but he's talking about our human effort. Often in virtually all times, I'll put it this way, all times with few exceptions, when the Bible uses the term flesh, it's talking about human effort. There are times when the term flesh actually means all of humanity. But here he's talking about human effort. We who serve God by His Spirit, who boast in Christ Jesus, and who put no confidence in the flesh. Then he does an interesting thing. It's almost like he's baiting them. Though I myself, in verse 4, though I myself have reasons for such confidence. If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. It's as though Paul was saying, dude, if you want to keep score, let's keep score, because I'll whoop you. Though I myself have reasons for such confidence. If someone thinks they have reason to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. And then he starts listing out, which is what is really his pedigree, circumcised on the 8th day. All right? That's where this obedient life begins, on day 8 for a Jewish baby boy, circumcised on the 8th day. Of the people of Israel, this is not like I was a Gentile who converted. Of the tribe of Benjamin, Benjamin was a noble tribe, a Hebrew of Hebrews. And then he goes on to describe what in the world does he mean by Hebrew of Hebrews. Okay. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. You have to realize, you've heard of the Pharisees dozens and dozens of times. They were Jesus's primary adversary. They were the ones who were the antagonists of Jesus' entire life as an adult man in ministry. But by the time they come on the scene with Jesus, they are a corrupt bunch of guys. They do some very evil things to Jesus, and not only to Jesus. History bears out that they were, by the time of Jesus' life, they had become highly political, and they were hugely powerful within Israel. But they didn't start that way. There's about 300 years of silence between the end of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, and the beginning of the New Testament, the book of Matthew. This is called the intertestamental period. And during that period, Israel was not so much held hostage as oppressed by a variety of different national powers. And the one of those powers were the Greeks, the other primary one were the Romans. During that period of time, there was a pretty despicable Roman ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes. He was just horrible. To the Jews, the most filthy, unclean animal of all was the pig. Well, what Antiochus did is he took a pig and he butchered it and then sacrificed it on the altar of the temple in Jerusalem, which was that was as horrible an abomination as a Jew could imagine. Well, various other things happened during this time, but one of the things that happened was there were brothers, the Maccabees, and they began to stand in resistance to the oppression of the Romans. The Pharisees grew up as a movement of men, no women Pharisees, all men, who were sick and tired of Israel laying down, of Israel going with the flow, of Israel blending in with the culture. They stood firm and they stood brightly against the backdrop of a very, they were a slumbering group of Israelites who seemed to not care too much about what was going on. They especially seemed to be dead to their relationship with God. So the Pharisees began as a movement to call Israel back to God. Well, a couple 100 years later, they had become not so much calling people back to God as the critics of culture and society. They had become the elite. They were generally the most well-educated. They were certainly outspoken. And Paul was a Pharisee, and not accidentally. He chose to be a Pharisee. And then he goes on to say in verse 6, as for zeal, persecuting the church. See, it wasn't just that. It's not like Paul was a Shriner. He had the secret handshake. He knew where the lodge hall was and all of those things. That's not what the Pharisees were. The Pharisees ruled Israel. Well, especially in matters of religion and social behaviors. Now, Rome was the ultimate government in those days, and Rome, if as you study the last days of Jesus' life, the passion of Jesus, you realize that Rome delegated a considerable amount of authority to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the other major group of religious leaders in Israel. Paul said, I was one of those guys, and it's worse than that. I persecuted the church. He went with papers. In Acts chapter 9, you have the story of Paul's conversion. He had papers to go to Damascus to arrest men and women who were part of the way, or that is the church, and to drag them back to Jerusalem where they would be tried and punished. Now, the punishments could be very severe, to be flogged, to be whipped. Not so much to be put to death, although you remember the story of Stephen, the first martyr. Because of his outspoken commitment to Jesus, there's quite a dialogue that happens, but the result of his dialogue was the Jews stoned him to death. And in fact, Paul, a younger Paul, was there in that crowd holding the coats of the men who threw the stones to kill Stephen. Wow. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless. That's a term that deserves a look. When Paul lived his life under the law as a Pharisee and as a Jew, Israelite among Israelites, a Jew of Jews, this Pharisee, he can say, I did it. I did. I got straight A's. I did everything that was expected of me. I followed the law flawlessly, without a flaw. Wow. I'll just share with you, and maybe you've had this experience too. People who think they are really good people, but don't know Jesus, are often very difficult to convince to take a look at Jesus because they don't need him. They can do this all on their own. I find it a lot easier to talk to people whose lives are a wreck because they realize, I can't do this. Paul drew this picture of himself saying, if anybody has legitimate reason to have confidence in their own achievement as far as it goes with their relationship with God, it should be me. We're going to stop there because my time's more than up. And then we're going to pick it up next time right where we left off. And I'm going to wait to make the application, to pull into the application station until we finish this passage. So I just want to say thanks for joining me. Thanks for being here. And give care to your soul, would you? I'll see you next time.